Hey guys, so here I am with another episode of things that tend to mess us up. And this is a list of common items and technologies that are present in many of our lives, but because of the way in which we have to interact with them and oftentimes adapt to them as we interact with them, they can have a negative impact on our comfort, our mobility, and our overall well-being. And what I'm going to recommend is to either avoid using these items and technologies, or at the very least be aware of their negative impacts and take some steps in order to manage those impacts so that you can minimize those negative effects. And what I'm going to go through in this video would be mirrors, and more specifically, training and exercising while using mirrors. All right, mirrors. So what's the big deal? Well, there's nothing inherently wrong about a mirror, but when you train and exercise heavily using a mirror, it doesn't end up serving you in the rest of your life. Now, why do I say that? How could I say that? Well, the thing is, when you are out hiking on a trail, or you're on a field, you're an athlete and you're trying to compete, perhaps you are an Olympic lifter and you're trying to hoist that weight above head, perhaps you're interacting with another opponent and you're trying to compete and win at the sport that you're doing, you're never actually going to be using a mirror as feedback when you're doing that. You need to be able to actually perceive yourself, where you are, where your body is, and where you are, where your body is in the environment around it. So when one heavily uses mirrors in their training to perhaps check their form or make sure their form is looking the way that they want it to, it is heavily using a part of our perception that is not going to be available to us when we're actually trying to go about our lives or when we're going about whatever we are training for. Now, that being said, using a mirror is very helpful to perhaps see what you are doing and perhaps make a correction, but you cannot stop there and you cannot become dependent on that. You must be able to step away from the mirror and then be able to perceive that form, perceive that manner of doing that by the way that it feels through your body, through the pressure, through your feet or whatever part of you is interacting with the ground, through the stretch that going into those ranges, through the muscles, through the parts that are working to leverage that movement. So you can use a mirror, but you've got to, as quick as possible, step away from it and then try to sense what's going on without that visual feedback. Now, the other thing about mirrors is that it doesn't actually reflect you as you are. It is a reflection. It is the opposite of what you're actually doing. Now, when you hear me say that, that's pretty common sense. Well, yes, of course, but it's actually fairly profound, because when you are looking at a mirror, and we get used to looking at mirrored reflections throughout our lives, we get used to seeing our own faces not as they are, but the opposite of what they are. And it can be quite trippy at times for folks when they see a picture of themselves and it's not that flipped image. It can look kind of odd to them. Now, in this space that I have where I help people with chronic or reoccurring aches, pains, problems, I have no mirrors in the space. There is no mirror on the wall when a person is looking around and moving through this space. When we're working on things, when we're engaging, there is no mirrored surface for them to be able to view themselves or view any reflection of. And that's on purpose, because what I'm trying to help a person do is better and more accurately sense themselves. And a mirrored reflection is not only something that's not useful because it's not always going to be available to them in the vast majority of their life, so let's not get dependent on it, but a mirrored reflection is also inaccurate. And there is a mirror that I have in this space that helps a person appreciate that there is no universal perception and that perhaps their perception may be a bit off from reality, and it's something that's called a true mirror. All right, so what exactly does it look like when you gaze at a true mirror? Well, it looks like yourself. You've got two mirrors in this true mirror right here, and they come together, and you got a little dial that can make it so that it either converges just right, or if it's a little off, you can see like a line. And as you get it just lined up, the two reflections work off of each other so that the image that you see is yourself as it is, not the reflected flipped one. And so when a person is looking at this, it can be quite jarring because they're staring at their face and they're used to seeing it in the reflected manner in the mirror as they're talking, but then they see this flip face and it's like their doppelganger looking at them and talking. So this is something that you could even pick up off of Amazon. It's somewhat expensive, but anyone can get it, and it's actually a really helpful thing to gaze at in order to help retrain perception, assumptions about perception, retrain even just self-awareness just by looking at this sort of thing. However, I'm not having people looking at it regularly, it's just at times, and for the rest of the time, I have it facing away, and we're doing the work throughout this space and in the time that we spend together to help them perceive themselves proprioceptively, perceive their feet on the ground, perceive their body as it's moving through space, and not getting this constant visual feedback while they're doing it. So if you're not going to use mirrors, what can you use for visual feedback? Well, I'm not saying don't use mirrors. Mirrors can be very useful, but simply use them and walk away from them. Other helpful things to do would be to film yourself doing a movement and then view it after the fact. Smartphones makes it really easy for us to do that and get some ready feedback. But what's great about when you're filming yourself on say your smartphone, you view it, and then you go about doing the movement again based off of that feedback, is that you're not actually watching yourself move in real time and using that visual feedback while you're doing the movement. You get to watch yourself, a recording of yourself in the past, have some thoughts about what maybe went well and maybe didn't. Perhaps there's a coach in your life or perhaps a therapist in your life that's then giving you some feedback about it. And then you go back to that movement without that visual feedback, be it a mirror or that screen, and you go about trying to perceive what it is that you're trying to tune or change. That works great. But having a mirror in front of you while you're trying to learn how to squat, steady on a leg, how to be able to drive or reach your arms overhead or behind you, whatever that movement is, having a mirror as feedback is something that may be helpful in some instances, but you gotta quickly move beyond and not look to get back to it. Now, there are some times where mirrors are helpful in training and exercise. And the two big ones would be when you're trying to elicit greater motor recruitment in the case of perhaps bodybuilding or trying to create just in general hypertrophy of a muscle. There is a lot of evidence, and people will also experience this quite readily, that if they look at the muscle while they're contracting it, whether it's themselves or in the mirror, that muscle will be able to contract harder and more cleanly. That said, that is not going to necessarily have carryover on an athletic field or allow you to necessarily stick a landing and not roll an ankle when you have to react on, say, uneven ground. It's not going to build athleticism, but it will allow someone to contract and engage a higher amount of motor recruitment, so it has its uses in those situations. The other situation where mirrors can be extremely helpful is when we are rehabilitating a neurologic injury where a limb has a sensory deficit, where a limb has a motor deficit, and we're trying to regain some use of that limb. And what they'll do is it's called mirror therapy, where they will set up a mirror in between the involved and the uninvolved hand, and they have the person look to the side where the involved hand is, but there is a mirror dividing, and so they end up seeing, as they're moving the uninvolved hand, it looks to their brain when they look to, say, that hand, as if that hand is moving. And it's incredible how helpful that can be in creating a connection centrally in the brain to allow a person to get greater use and even to begin to use that limb that was affected, but it's hard to bridge that gap and get those connections going. All right, so in summary, mirrors are something that can be used for training purposes, but they have very limited use, and they certainly don't serve us in giving us a better life when it comes to the way that we take on strength training, athletic training, and just making it so that we move around like a more capable human being. So in your own exercise habits, know that you want to have a limited amount of mirrors available to you. And in fact, if you're designing your own exercise space, remove mirrors from them. You do not want to be distracted by them visually in the corner of your eye, certainly not in front of you. Focus on perceiving your body through the ground, through the movements that you're doing, and use mirrors sparingly. Favor, if you're going to get some visual feedback, using a recording and viewing it after the fact and then returning to the movement again. But in general, avoid the use of mirrors because it is not accurate feedback. It is a reflected, mirrored feedback, and you're going to do best focusing on sensing yourself without them. Your life will be better because of it.